There is no evidence that Mr. Manafort colluded with the Russian government.
In that 31-page indictment, there is absolutely no evidence connecting any of Paul Manafort's activities to the Trump campaign. That's the bombshell here.
President Trump pushed back hard, tweeting sorry, but this is years ago, before Paul Manafort was part of the Trump campaign.
Tony Podesta is now stepping down from his lobbying group because he is being investigated by the special counsel.
U.S. Special Operations Forces captured a 46-year-old militant alleged to have been involved in the deadly attacks in Benghazi.
Army Sergeant Bo Bergdahl took the stand and apologized to all the military personnel wounded in the search for him. As a judge now decides whether he will get life in prison.
The U.S. population essentially could care less about Washington, D.C. Most people in America look at Washington with amusement.
Halloween by lights.
Fiber optics. You tell everyone every morning, Brian, to get dressed.
Yes.
Tell them to wear orange today.
Right. I guess you could wear orange.
Get
dressed in a costume.
Wait, where is your orange? Neither one of you have on anything Halloween.
No, this relates to the costume I'm going to wear later at the end of the program. What sort of costume do you think we're going to be clad in just about 3 hours from now? Email us, friends@foxnews.com.
I know what my costume is. I do not know what yours is.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I do know who's coming in, but don't give it away.
Okay.
Okay.
I saw Brian's. It's very funny.
What are you dressing up? You're going to actually
us.
Dress up?
I have no idea.
You're going to
Brian
dress
is
up.
not for Halloween.
Right. I'm against it because I did this thing called I grew up. I became an adult, and I realized that's for children. There you go.
How do you feel about Christmas,
right?
With the presents for Christmas?
No holidays. I grew up. No, I'm pro Christmas. But meanwhile, some great news.
Indeed, we've got a Fox News alert at 2 minutes after the top of the hour. This is something we didn't see coming. U.S. Navy SEALs captured one of the militants accused of orchestrating the deadly attacks in 2012 in Benghazi.
And he's expected on U.S. soil to face charges.
Griff Jenkins joins us now from Washington with more on this story. Griff?
Good morning, guys. Good news indeed. U.S. Special Operations Forces and FBI agents captured Mustafa al-Imam in a high-stakes joint operation along Libya's north coast at an unknown location. Imam, a member of the Islamic group Ansar al-Sharia, is believed to have played an instrumental role in the Benghazi attacks 5 years ago that killed 4 Americans. You remember them: U.S. Ambassador Christopher Stevens, Glenn Doherty, Sean Smith, and Tyrone Woods. President Trump gave the orders for this operation, and in a statement he says, quote, "To the families of these fallen heroes, I want you to know that your loved ones are not forgotten, and they will never be forgotten. Our memory is deep and our reach is long, and we will not rest in our efforts to find and bring the perpetrators of this heinous attacks in Benghazi to justice." The Trump administration's vigorous investigation has been different from the Obama administration, which has been criticized for the way it handled it. Multiple congressional investigations have sought to determine if the Obama administration willfully misled the public when former UN Ambassador Susan Rice appeared on numerous shows blaming the attack on a controversial video.
There was a hateful video, a direct result of a heinous and offensive video. This is a response to a hateful and offensive video. Violent protest outside of our embassy sparked by this hateful video.
Attorney General Jeff Sessions has weighed in, calling this a barbaric attack that shocked the American people, and added in a statement, "The United States will continue to investigate and identify all those who were involved in the attack, and we will hold them accountable for their crimes." Sessions says al-Imam will be brought to D.C. and charged in federal court. And earlier this month, I should point out that another man, Ahmed Abu Khattala, went on trial here in D.C. for his alleged role in the attack as well. So some good news this Halloween, bringing the Benghazi perpetrators to justice.
Yeah, I know we're going to talk about it later, but I'm surprised he's not steaming to Gitmo. You know, that's where you can get some interrogation done. I'm surprised we're still using the court system for these terrorists.
Thank you very much, Griff. It does sound as if the 13-day trip that it has taken this guy to get to the United States, that's probably when they did some question asking.
Well, and earlier this month they began that trial in the mastermind behind Benghazi. So one by one they're getting these guys. I'm glad that has not been forgotten for the sake of these families that are mourning those 4 individuals.
Absolutely. So he is headed to a courtroom. Speaking of which, yesterday Robert Mueller had a 1-2 punch. It was unveiled that apparently there's a 12-point indictment against Paul Manafort and Richard Gates, but at the same time it was unveiled that there was a guilty plea. This was unsealed regarding a fellow by the name of George Papadopoulos, who had been a volunteer with the campaign. So, which is interesting because we didn't realize at that point that Mr. Mueller had flipped somebody without word leaking out.
So if you believe the Washington Post, the president not upset and not that unexpected that Gates and Manafort were indicted because of what he did before the campaign. But the biggest surprise was Papadopoulos, who evidently was arrested the day after Manafort's house was raided on July 27th at Dulles, at which time, if you look at the legal language, he might have been wearing a wire. That's why it wasn't announced, and possibly working for the prosecution here and working for Robert Mueller.
That's his picture right there. His title was Trump Campaign Foreign Policy Advisor. Sarah Huckabee Sanders yesterday said it was a volunteer position. He's in trouble because he allegedly lied to the FBI, and he's pleaded guilty to that. He lied about a relationship that he had with a professor over in Russia.
Right. He was asked by the feds, so tell us about this relationship with this person who reached out to you, and apparently they were fishing around looking for opposition research on Hillary Clinton. Sound familiar? He's in trouble simply because he did not tell the truth. So when you look at Manafort and Gates and you look at this, you think, well, is there much there? The president tweeted this, sorry, but this is years ago, before Paul Manafort was part of the Trump campaign, but why aren't crooked Hillary and the Dems the focus? Also, he said, there is no collusion. And indeed, all of the stuff that happened with Paul Manafort and Mr. Gates, money laundering, tax stuff, which is alleged years before.
Alan Dershowitz sat on this couch yesterday and says, look, this is a strategy. This is strategy, and say to Manafort and Gates, you got 20 years in prison. Do you want to do that, or you want to give me additional information? If there's no additional information,
he's getting 20 years.
He gets 20 years, and they look for good lawyering, and they believe they're innocent. By the way, they have to put on their case yet, and a lot of stuff that they're doing in terms of these offshore accounts, it doesn't necessarily mean they're hiding it. That means they're working at doing international business, and they decide to park it there. So they'll fight back on this.
Well, Mueller said many people don't trust Robert Mueller. I mean, he has his team, mostly Democrats. We'll get into that later in the show. Many people don't trust him. He's trying to find something on someone connected with the president so he can figure out if there's collusion there. Chief of Staff John Kelly was on last night. Laura Ingraham, her show started last night. So did Shannon Bream. Proud of those ladies. They did a great job. She sat down, Laura Ingraham did, with John Kelly, the Chief of Staff, for about 30 minutes of her show. It was an excellent interview. And this is what he said. He said, you know what, you out there, middle America, you really don't care about this.
The U.S. population outside of the echo chamber that is Washington essentially could care less about Washington, D.C. If you go out there into the hinterlands, people don't care. They're disgusted. You know, if you look at the rates of acceptance among the U.S. population, the U.S. Congress, the media is all way down in the single digits or in the teens. Most people in America look at Washington with amusement, but not with an awful lot of respect or interest. So I think it's doubly important that when these kind of accusations are made, that they should be investigated.
Indeed. Meanwhile, there is one, and we didn't exactly see this coming. John Podesta, it was Hillary Clinton's campaign manager. His brother, Tony, ran until yesterday, the Podesta Group. The Podesta Group and Mercury were listed, it is presumed, to be Company A and Company B, which were in the unsealed indictments yesterday, talking about some of the work that Manafort did with the Ukraine. So Mr. Podesta said, you know what, I should step down, and he did.
He cited the pressure that he's getting from places like Fox News for the reason. But wait a second, you're working with Paul Manafort. Manafort gets indicted yesterday, and you got to wonder how much trouble Tony Podesta is actually in, and does he wait for a time in which there's a flood of news to actually make this huge story?
Made me laugh when he blamed Fox News, because if you're doing something wrong, then you're not going to, we don't have a story to talk about. So don't blame us for something that you did. It reminds me of Hillary Clinton. Remember, she blamed everyone else for losing the election. Meanwhile, she was the reason for having that server.
Sure. And Hillary Clinton actually was with Sidney Blumenthal and Tony Podesta yesterday over the weekend celebrating her birthday.
Well, one of the interesting things about what was handed down yesterday, the indictments, regarded the fact that Mr. Manafort hadn't filed certain paperwork. The Podesta Group didn't file paperwork until August, all retroactive as well. So how did they know what was going on? Also, in that same interview with John F. Kelly, Laura Ingraham was asking him whether or not he would apologize to Congresswoman Frederica Wilson from down in Florida regarding what he said she recounted that day that he was down in Florida at the dedication of an FBI building. He said, you know what, if I need to apologize for something, I will, but in this case, I will not apologize to her. Also,
let's listen.
Also, he talked a little bit about what it was like that same week where he went to Arlington Cemetery.
Most powerful statement in that entire interview, I thought, last night. Listen to this.
What did I hear over in Arlington Cemetery? Some of the stones over there represent young people that I sent out into battle and they died. Not to make it more melodramatic than it is, but my wondering was, is any of this worth it anymore? If someone can make political hay out of something that the president was trying to do, and of course the screams, and a lot of you viewers will laugh at this, I'm sure, but the screams out of the graves was, you know, what are you talking about, Kelly? You know, you got it easy. Look where we are. It's worth it. Outside of this cesspool or swamp or whatever it's called, where Americans are just doing the best they can, working hard, raising their family, paying their taxes, hoping to send their kids off to college someday. That makes it all worthwhile. But I just don't know how anyone could possibly criticize another human being for doing the best he or she could do to express sorrow from the bottom of their hearts. It was stunning to me.
Yeah, it was stunning. And that's when he sat there next to the president and watched him call. And if someone didn't appreciate the call, that's their option. But he's just saying, how could this all get twisted into politics? And I just thought it was an unbelievable interview last night. Put everything in perspective.
It did indeed. All right, 12 minutes now after the top of the hour on this Halloween. And the left is desperately trying to connect the dots between Paul Manafort's indictment and the president. But our next guest says it doesn't add up. Eric Erickson is doing the math, and despite the political left trying to connect the dots between President Trump and yesterday's indictment of Paul Manafort and Rick Gates, our next guest says, nice try. In his new op-ed, Eric Erickson writes, quote, the American left will continue to believe in an elaborate conspiracy. It is far easier to believe that than to believe Hillary Clinton ran a terrible campaign. Joining us right now is Fox News contributor and the author of that, Eric Erickson. Eric, what are you trying to say?
That, you know, the left is still hanging to the Russians stole the election because they can't admit that Donald Trump actually beat Hillary Clinton, that they all thought he was going to be beaten and she was such a terrible candidate, he beat her. Okay, so the news came out that not only was there a 12-point indictment against Mr. Manafort and Mr. Gates, but also this low-level volunteer on the campaign, George Papadopoulos, apparently flipped. And it sounds like he's been cooperating with the feds ever since he pled guilty to lying to them. Right. Listen, you know, one of the things that campaigns do is they give people titles. It makes them feel empowered. He had a title. He was a volunteer on the campaign. That doesn't mean he was embedded in the campaign. If anything, it proves there was no collusion because according to his testimony, the Russians came to him and said they already had the email. So the Trump team couldn't have gotten with the Russians to try to find emails if the Russians already had them. Sure. And, you know, the whole thing about the Trump team and the involvement is, aside from the fact that Mr. Manafort and Mr. Gates were part of the Trump team, all this stuff happened a long time ago. Right. Listen, they're probably reaching back to build some pressure, but Manafort was a dubious character to begin with. He knew the RNC rules and was able to make sure that nobody could steal the nomination from Trump, but he had all sorts of problems with Russians and other despots overseas. So, I mean, he was a shady figure to begin with, and it's caught up to him. Well, what do you make? That has nothing to do with the president. What do you make of the fact that with this 12-count indictment, it looks like Robert Mueller is trying to throw the book at Mr. Gates and Mr. Manafort as well? Well, you know, it's pretty typical as a prosecutor. You charge as many things as you can, and you can scale them back later. If you don't charge now, though, you could get a double jeopardy issue accusation leveled against you later. And there was a statute of limitations issue in going after Manafort. He had to go on and indict all these things. He can scale it back later, but they're probably trying to build pressure on him to help rat him out. But listen, if Vladimir Putin were really involved, there's no way that Paul Manafort's going to rat out Vladimir Putin.
Sure. The lead op-ed this morning in the Wall Street Journal says the main charge against Donald Trump, poor judgment hiring a notorious Beltway operator in the form of Paul Manafort, because historically Paul Manafort and his group have worked for essentially a rogues gallery of dictators and a lot of other questions.
It's entirely possible he went to work for Trump to help someone else. I mean, they whittled back the Ukraine language in the RNC agenda, maybe so, but that makes the president a victim of someone else. It doesn't mean that he was involved.
Sure. And remember, he was brought on the campaign because it sounds like they were going to try, some of the other candidates for president on the Republican side were going to try to grab some of his delegates, so they brought in the guy who was the expert, and that guy, Paul Manafort.
Yeah, very much so. Questionable character, but you know, the president did fire him.
He did indeed. All right, and now he's in a lot of trouble, Mr. Manafort is. All right, Eric Erickson, thank you very much for joining us live today.
Thanks very much.
You bet. All right, meanwhile, at 6:20 here in New York City, they left for the fight. They left to fight, that is to say, for terrorists in Syria. Now they're returning home to free housing and counseling and jobs. Seriously, we're going to tell you about that. And it's a story that has so many of you fired up. George Washington's church removing the George Washington plaque because that plaque says it makes them feel unsafe. So is the church worshiping politics or God? Lauren Green is in the house, and she's next.
Good morning to you and welcome back. We have a Fox News alert. The manhunt for an armed and dangerous shooting suspect intensifying at the University of Utah. Police say Austin Butane shot and killed someone in a carjacking near the school, causing a 6-hour lockdown for students and staff. It happened shortly after his wife went to campus to report that he had assaulted her. Classes are canceled today as police and the FBI continue to hunt for Butane. Emotional testimony in Bo Bergdahl's sentencing hearing after a judge rules President Trump's comments would not keep him from receiving a fair trial. The disgraced Army sergeant offering a tearful apology to the service members wounded searching for him, saying, quote, "My words can't take away the pain that people have been through." Bergdahl faces life in prison, his sentence expected to be handed down by the end of the week. The defense rests in the corruption trial of Democratic Senator Bob Menendez after the judge denies his request for a mistrial. The judge calling his argument for it, quote, silly. Menendez is accused of handing out favors in exchange for donations. Ainsley.
Thank you, Jillian. President Trump warned of what could happen if we keep erasing history.
George Washington was a slave owner. Was George Washington a slave owner? So will George Washington now lose his status? Are we going to take down, are we going to take down statues to George Washington? How about Thomas Jefferson? What do you think of Thomas Jefferson? You like him?
I do.
Okay, good. Are we going to take down the statue? Because he was a major slave owner. Now we're going to take down his statue. So you know what? It's fine. You're changing history. You're changing culture.